In the last video, we talked about the concept of scoping and why it has broken our calculator. In this video, I'm going to show you an example code for scoping so that we can fix the way our calculator is performing. I'm also going to show you what is global variables versus local variables, and scoping when it comes to functions and for loops. So let's see how we can fix this. Firstly, here when we start print instructions, this is the first time something executes in Python. Before, all of these lines are defining new functions for Python to use. In calculate, we're accessing the variable number1 and number2 and failing because number1 and number2 doesn't exist within the local scope of calculate. So how do we do this? So we need to create a variable number1 and number2 in the global scope so that we can then pass it on to calculate, so calculate has it in the local scope. So the way we do this is we want to use the return statement to return both number1 and number2. We then retrieve this by typing number1 comma number2 equals to ask input. So what is happening here is in ask input, when we define ask input as a function, we have returned two numbers separated by a comma. Here, as you recall in earlier videos, this is an assignment. When we assign two variables like this, we need to return two variables so that number1 gets populated by the value of the first number and num2 gets populated by the value of the second number. And because we're assigning to an expression, Python would actually evaluate and execute the function askInput, which then in turn executes the line inputs, the three inputs here to get the choice. Actually, we also need to return the choice. Now that I think about it, choice, catch. And then because we have returned choice number1 and number2, we can then assign it in the same sequence into these variables choice, num1 and num2. And then we can pass choice num1 and num2 into calculate. And we actually need to also create three inputs in the input field between the parentheses so that choice can be used within calculate's local scope. And similarly, num1 can be used within choice calculate's local scope. And notice that this further then propagates down into addition's local scope, subtract's local scope, multiplication's local scope, and so on and so forth. If you run this now, this should perform like the old calculation. And so that was very simple. The thing you need to remember about scoping is you need to understand whether something is global scoped or locally scoped into a function. As we progress to more and more complicated Python scripts, we'll eventually have everything in a function, and you need to make sure that all your variables are handled correctly. Fortunately, if you're using an IDE like PyCharm, it will automatically alert you when scoping is done incorrectly.